Hello, children. Welcome to our next class in history. Our today's lesson is the making of the national movement 1870s to 1947. In the previous chapters, you had come to know that Britishers came to India as merchants. Then they started conquering territories and started to establish their power in many kingdoms. They introduced new laws and administrations so that they can get enough revenue from our country, and this will help them in trading with India. That is, using Indian money to buy Indian goods and selling the Indian products at a higher price in Western market. We also came to know that their too much of interference affected the lives of the kings, of peasants and tribals. Though Britishers tried to control the territories, but they also wanted to win over the Indian people. And that's why they started bringing changes in the education and social life of people of India. Debates regarding the condition of women were held, and many new laws were formed to change the plight of Indian women as well as to eradicate caste system from India. Apart from this, there were many social and religious reform brought by the Britishers. Although the Britishers had brought so many changes in India, people of India believed that the interference of Britishers in their social and educational system is affecting their religious sentiments as well. And that's why there arose a wave of nationalism in India after the Indian people realized that they were treated as slaves in their own country and in their own soil. Hence, gradually there arose a spirit of nationalism, which meant India was a land only for Indians, and this included people of all classes, color, caste, creed, language, or gender. This also meant that the country's resources and systems were meant only for the Indians. Hence, they wanted to prove that Britishers have no right over Indian people. The consciousness began to be clearly stated by the political associations formed after 1850, especially those who came into being in the 1870s and 1880s. These political associations were mostly formed by English educated professionals such as the lawyers. The most important ones were the Purna Sarvajanik Sabha, the Indian Association, the Madras Mahajan Sabha, the Bombay Presidency Association, and of course the Indian National Congress. Though all these associations worked in particular part of the country, but their ultimate objective was that all the people of India should experience their wholesome right over the country and its resources. All these groups worked with the idea that people should be sovereign. The word sovereign means the capacity of a person to act independently or individually without interference or force by someone else. This sovereignty was a modern concept and was an important feature of nationalism. In other words, they believed that the Indian people should be empowered to take decision on their own regarding the affairs of the country. Indians were truly very unhappy with the British rule. Particularly, this dissatisfaction grew more and more from 1870s to 1880s. The Arms Act passed in 1878 did not allow Indians to possess arms like guns or ammunitions, and also the Vernacular Press Act, which stated that nobody can say anything wrong about the British government, also angered Indians because this Vernacular Press Act allowed the government to take over the assets of newspaper, including their printing press, if the newspaper published anything wrong about the British government. So Indians were truly very unhappy. In 1883, there was an attempt to bring out the Ilbert Bill. Now, Ilbert Bill was a rule which stated that if a British person does anything wrong, then the trial of British or European persons can be heard by the Indian judges. This was brought in order to bring equality between British and Indian judges in the country. But when European people opposed the bill, the British government withdrew the bill and Indians were angered because of this. This brought out the racial attitudes of British in India. The Indian National Congress was established when 72 delegates from all over the country met at Bombay in December 1885. Dadabhai Naoroji, a businessman and publicist settled in London, guided the younger nationalists. A retired British official, A.O. Hume, also played a part in bringing Indians from the various regions together. It is often said that the Congress in the first 20 years was moderate in its objectives and methods. Congress demanded a greater place for Indians in the government and administration. It wanted that many more Indians should take part in the legislative councils and be given more power, particularly in places where the Indian National Congress had no association. It demanded that Indians be given high positions in the government. For this, they wanted that the civil service examinations which were held in London should also be held in India as well. Moreover, as Britishers who were holding the high post were sending a large part of their salary to their home in Britain, Indians felt that if Indians are given a chance to be at a higher position, then it will stop in the draining of wealth to England. Indian National Congress also wanted that judiciary should be excluded from executive, and Arms Act and the Vernacular Press Act should be removed from Indian laws. Following are the other issues raised by the Congress. Number 1. It declared that the British rule had brought poverty and famines in India due to the increase in the land revenue, which impoverished Indian peasants and zamindars. The export of grains to Europe has also created food shortage in India. Number 2. The Congress demanded reduction of revenue, cut in military expenditure and more funds for irrigation. Indian National Congress also wanted a lot of changes to be brought into the salt tax imposed by the British, the treatment of Indian laborers abroad, and the sufferings of forest dwellers. These early congressmen, who were called as moderates, wanted to develop public awareness about the unjust nature of the British rule. So, they published newspapers, wrote articles, and showed how British rule was leading to the economic ruin of the country. They criticized British rule in their speeches and sent representatives to different parts of the country. They felt that the British had respect for the ideals of freedom and justice, and so they would accept the just demands of Indians. But by the 1890s, many Indians began to raise questions about the political style of the Congress. In Bengal, Maharashtra and Punjab, leaders such as Bipin Chandra Pal, Bal Gangadhar Tilak and Lala Lajpat Rai were beginning to explore radical objectives and methods. They criticized the moderates for their politics of prayers and emphasized the importance of self-reliance and constructive work. Hence, we can see that in Indian National Congress, there were now two groups. One was the moderates and the other the radicals. Moderates felt that writing letters will help them to get their demands fulfilled by the British government, whereas the radicals were of the view that people must rely on their own strength. In 1905, Viceroy Curzon partitioned Bengal. The reason for dividing Bengal from India was that British government was finding it difficult to administer such a big province because it included Bengal, Bihar, and parts of Orissa. But actually, it was to split the Bengali people. The partition of Bengal angered people all over India. All sections of the Congress, whether it was the moderates or the radicals, they all called to oppose the partition of Bengal. Public meetings and demonstrations were organized, and novel methods of mass protest developed in every corner of the country. This struggle was called as Swadeshiv Movement and also known as the Vande Mataram movement. The Swadeshi movement sought to oppose British rule and encourage the ideas Swadeshi enterprise, national education, and use of Indian language. To fight for Swaraj, the radicals advocated mass mobilization and boycott of British institutions and goods. Some individuals also began to suggest that revolutionary violence would be necessary to overthrow British rule from India. A group of Muslim landlords and Nawabs formed the All India Muslim League at Dhaka in 1906. The league supported the partition of Bengal. It desired separate electorates for Muslims. Some seats in the councils were now reserved for Muslims who would be elected by Muslim voters. Meanwhile, the Congress also split up in 1907. After the split, the Congress came to be dominated by the moderates. The two groups reunited in December 1915. The Congress and the All India Muslim League signed the historic Lucknow Pact and decided to work together for respective government in the country. Freedom struggle grew much more after the end of First World War in 1919. Due to the First World War, there was a lot of economic and political expenses borne by Indians. As the British government had to spend a lot of money on the defense, it increased taxes from individual income and also from businessmen. Increased military expenditure and the demands of war supplies led to a sharp rise which created great difficulties for the common people. On the other hand, business groups reaped fabulous profits after the war. We have already learned in the earlier lessons that due to the great demand of goods in war, much of the import from Britain was stopped. This led to a sharp increase in the demand of Indian goods such as jute bags, cloth, rails, etc. So Indian business groups began to demand greater opportunities for development. It is in these situations that Mahatma Gandhi emerged as a mass leader. Gandhiji, aged 46, arrived in India in 1915 from South Africa. Having led Indians in that country in a non-violent marches against racial restrictions, he was already a respected leader known internationally. Mahatma Gandhi spent his first year in traveling throughout the country, understanding the people, their needs, and the overall situation. In 1919, Gandhiji called a satyagraha against the Rowlatt Act. Rowlatt Act strengthened the police powers to arrest anyone who spoke against the government. So Gandhiji and Muhammad Ali Jinnah felt that the government had no right to stop people's basic freedom. Hence, Gandhiji asked the Indian people to observe 6 April 1919 as the day of non-violent opposition to this Rowlatt Act. Satyagraha Sabhas were set up to launch the movement. The Rowlatt Satyagraha turned out to be the first all-India struggle against the British government. In April 1919, there was a number of demonstrations and strikes in the country, and the government used brutal measures to suppress them. The Jallianwala atrocity caused by General Dyer in Amritsar on Baisakhi Day, that is on 13th April, was a part of such repression. In 1920, the British imposed a harsh treaty to control the Turkish Sultan or Khalifa. People were furious about this as they had been about the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. Indian Muslims wanted that the Khalifa be allowed to have a position to control over Muslim sacred places in the erstwhile Ottoman Empire. The leaders Muhammad Ali and Shaukat Ali of the Khilafat agitation now wanted to bring out a non-cooperation movement. Gandhiji supported them and called Congress to campaign against the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, the Khilafat Treaty, and demand Swaraj from the British government. The non-cooperation movement gained force in 1921-22. Thousands of students left government-controlled schools and colleges. British titles were surrendered and legislatures boycotted. People burnt foreign cloths. In Kheda, Gujarat, peasants organized non-violent campaigns against the high land revenue demanded by the British. In coastal Andhra and interior Tamil Nadu, people wanted the shutdown of liquor shops. In the Guntur district of Andhra Pradesh, tribals and poor peasants staged a number of forest satyagrahas in which they allowed their cattle to graze into the forest without paying grazing fee. These forest tribals believed that Gandhiji would get their taxes reduced and have the forest regulations abolished. In Assam, tea garden laborers started demanding a big increase in their wages. They left the British owned plantations. We all know Gandhiji wanted that non-violent method was the effective method to get freedom from British. But he had to call off the non-cooperation movement in February 1922 after a crowd of peasants set fire to police station in Chauri Chaura. In the Chauri Chaura incident, 22 policemen were killed on that day. The peasants were provoked because the police had fired on their peaceful demonstrations. The decade 1920 closed with the Congress resolving to fight for Purna Swaraj, that is, complete independence. Independence Day was observed on 26 January 1930 all over the country. Soon, Gandhiji declared that he would lead a march to break the salt law. According to the salt law, the government alone had the right to manufacture and sell salt. Mahatma Gandhi, along with the other nationalists, reasoned that it was sinful to tax law since it is such an essential item of food. Gandhiji and his followers marched for over 240 miles from Sabarmati to the coastal town of Dandi, where they broke the government law by gathering natural salt found on the seashore and boiling seawater to produce salt. The government soon announced elections to the provincial legislatures in 1937. The Congress formed governments in 7 out of 11 provinces. In September 1939, after 2 years of Congress rule in the provinces, the Second World War broke out. Though Congress leaders were ready to support the British, but in return, they wanted that India should be granted independence once the Second World War comes to an end. As the British refused to agree to this demand, several of the Congress ministers resigned from their post to protest against the British government. It was under this time that Mahatma Gandhi started a new movement against the British in the middle of the Second World War. He wanted that British must quit India. Gandhiji and other leaders were jailed at once, but the movement spread. It specially attracted peasants and the youth who gave up their studies to join it. The first response of the British for such a big movement was of suppressing it. By the end of 1943, over 90,000 people were arrested and around 1,000 people were killed in police firing. In many areas, orders were given to machine gun crowds from airplanes. The rebellion, however, ultimately brought the British government to its knees. Meanwhile, in 1940, the Muslim League wanted a separate independent state for Muslims in the northwestern and eastern areas of the country. This was because from the late 1930s, the League began viewing that Muslims are a separate nation from the Hindus. The provincial elections of 1937 confirmed that Muslims were a minority, Muslim League also feared that Muslims may not get chances to be a part in the legislature. Moreover, the Congress also refused the League's desire to form a joint Congress League government in the United Provinces in 1937. All this made League to demand a separate nation for Muslims. The demand for a separate Muslim nation grew more in 1930s and 1940s when most of the Congress leaders were in jail. At the end of the war in 1945, the British opened negotiations between the Congress, the League, and themselves for the independence of India. The talks failed because the League saw itself as the sole spokesperson of India's Muslim. The Congress could not accept this claim because there were a large number of Muslims who still supported Congress. Hence, there were general elections held in 1946. Congress did well in all the general constituencies, but surprisingly, Leagues won more part in the Muslim dominated areas. Hence, Muslim League wanted pressurizing the government for a separate nation called Pakistan. In March 1946, the British cabinet sent a 3-member mission to Delhi to examine this demand and to suggest a suitable political framework for a free India. The mission suggested that India should remain united with some power given to Muslims, but it could not get the Muslim and the Congress agree to the specific details of the proposal. Hence, partition became inevitable. After the failure of the cabinet mission, the Muslim League announced 16th August 1946 as Direct Action Day. On this day, riots broke out in Calcutta, lasting for several days, resulting in the death of thousands of people. By March 1947, violence spread out to different parts of northern India. Many 100,000 people were killed, and numerous women had to face untold brutalities during the partition. Millions of people were forced to flee their homes, and a new country, Pakistan, was born. So the joy of our country's independence from British rule came mixed with the pain and violence of partition. Children, with that I conclude the lesson.